I saw that the ram struck with its horns to the west, to the north and to the south, and that no beast could stand before it, nor was there anyone who could escape its power, and he did according to his will, and became great. While I was considering this, behold, a goat was coming from the west over the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and that goat had a notable horn between its eyes.
Welcome, dear and distinguished listener. Today we present to you the vision of Daniel, the ram and the goat. Do you want to know what meaning this vision has? Very good. Let's follow you to the end of this video and discover together the meaning of this shocking vision. Before delving into this topic, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so that YouTube notifies you every time we publish a new video. Let's get started. We come today, dear listener, to chapter 8 of Daniel, whose general theme is the vision of the prophet about the ram and the goat. This vision was prophetic when it was revealed to Daniel and recorded by him. Now it should be noted that because it was so clearly and literally fulfilled in history, this chapter has formed the basis for critics to assign a late date for the writing of the book of Daniel. The critics' arguments are based on the fact that prophecy, referring to the future, is supernatural, and they do not believe in the supernatural. Therefore, they maintain that this prophecy could not have been written in the time of Daniel, but must have been written after the prophet, already as history. We hold the view that this prophetic book was written by Daniel in approximately 600 BC. Let us then read verses 1 and 2 of this 8th chapter of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me before. I saw in vision, and when I saw her, I was in Susa, which is the capital of the kingdom in the province of Elam. So I saw in vision, standing by the river Ulai. 2 years after Daniel had the dream of the 4 beasts in chapter 7, he had this vision again. Here we are presented with the historical framework in which Daniel received this new vision. It took place in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, when Daniel was in Susa, a city located about 370 kilometers east of Babylon, which later became the capital of the kingdom of Persia. It was located in what is now Iran, and was a highly developed city. The first known code of laws, the Code of Hammurabi, was found there. In a sense, Susa was a rival to Babylon itself in terms of cultural refinement. Already during the Persian Empire, King Ahasuerus built a majestic palace there in which the events recorded in the Book of Esther took place. And it was also there that Nehemiah served as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, as alluded to in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. Daniel tells us that he received the vision while standing by the Ulai River. This was a river or canal that watered the city of Susa. Let's continue reading verse 3. I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram stood before the river, and it had 2 horns. And although the horns were high, one was higher than the other, and the tallest grew afterwards. Here, a ram that had 2 horns is mentioned. In this same chapter in verse 20, this ram was clearly identified as representing the Medo-Persian Empire, which succeeded the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now we must stop here to consider the historical facts, and thus realize that it is God who has dominion over the kingdom of men. At first, the Medo-Persian Empire was 2 different kingdoms, however. When Cyrus the Great succeeded his father on the throne of Persia, he immediately rebelled against the Medes, and it did not take long to defeat them. This victory did not mean the annihilation of the Medes. The rise to power of the Achaemenids would serve to strengthen the union of both peoples. This policy of integration of Persia and Media became one of the main references of the reign of Cyrus the Great, along with its religious tolerance. After uniting the Medes and Persians under a single kingdom, Cyrus did not stop and set his sights on other kingdoms until he reached and conquered Babylon. Now, returning to our text, let us notice what it says. and it had 2 horns, and although the horns were high, one was higher than the other, and the tallest grew afterwards. Historically, Persia represented the upper horn, as it was the dominant power of the Medo-Persian Empire. This aspect of the vision is a reaffirmation of what had been revealed to Daniel about the second beast in the previous chapter. Speaking of this second power that would dominate the world in Daniel chapter 7 verse 5, says, which stood on one side more than on the other. The Persian side was taller than the side representing Media. The vision of the second beast in Daniel chapter 7 verse 5 and the ram in Daniel chapter 8 verse 3 describe the Persian leadership as the strongest in the Medo-Persian Empire. The Persian monarchs achieved predominance and greater influence over the Medes and led the empire to its climax. So this ram, with its 2 horns, and one of them more prominent than the other, was the Medo-Persian Empire, with a later superiority of the Persians. Let's continue reading verse 4. I saw that the ram struck with its horns to the west, to the north, and to the south, and that no beast could stand before it, nor was there anyone who could escape its power. And he did according to his will, and became great. The prophet observed the ram goring west, north, and south, which some have associated with the 3 ribs in the bear's mouth recorded in Daniel chapter 7 verse 5. Let us remember that the union of the Medes and Persians into a single empire served to create a very powerful army, such that there was no kingdom in those times that could stop its push. And what is described here are the 3 directions in which the Median-Persian Empire carried out its conquests. As a result of this, the prophet Daniel says that he did according to his will and became great. This led them to arrogance, thinking that there was no nation, army, or god that could stand against them. The Medo-Persian Empire was more of a world empire than Babylon, and for a time irresistible in its conquering career, and became to an eminent degree a despotic and vainglorious power. Let's continue reading verses 5 and 7. While I was considering this, behold, a goat was coming from the west over the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and that goat had a notable horn between its eyes. And he came to the 2-horned ram, which I had seen on the river bank, and ran against him with the fury of his strength. And I saw him come to the ram, and he rose up against him and smote him, and broke his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to stand before him. So he struck it down to the ground and trampled it, and there was no one to rescue the ram from its power. Now a goat enters the scene that came from the west over the face of the whole earth, without touching the earth. As the angel Gabriel explained in verse 21 of this same chapter, this goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and that its notable horn is its first king, who history would later show was Alexander the Great. As we know, under the direction of Alexander the Great, Greece managed to deploy an imposing military force with which in a very short time it managed to conquer the Median-Persian Empire. Alexander's first battle against the Persians would be on the banks of the Granic River, which occurred in the year 334 BC. In this battle, Alexander achieved his first victory over the forces of the Persian king, Darius III. Alexander the Great's second victory over the Persians would be in the year 333 BC in the famous Battle of Issos. This battle ended in a clear Greek victory, after which the Persian Empire lost all contact with its province of Egypt, the most lucrative and which would be conquered by Alexander after the siege of Gaza, permanently lost its access to the Mediterranean Sea, and lost all its provinces in Asia Minor. The battle was also the first time that the Persian army was defeated under King Darius III, and the first time that a Persian army commanded by its king was defeated, so the result caused a breakdown in Persian morale. And finally, in the year 331 BC, Alexander the Great would completely defeat Darius's army in the Battle of Gaugamela. The Battle of Gaugamela was one of Alexander the Great's greatest triumphs. Alexander's army was made up of approximately 47,000 soldiers, and on the other hand, Darius's army was made up of 250,000 Persian soldiers. Darius chose the location of this battle because it was a wide plain that favored his numerous mounted forces. Darius was defeated, and the battle marked the collapse of the Persian Empire. Gaugamela is considered a masterpiece in military tactics and the greatest victory of Alexander the Great. In this battle, Darius will flee, and while fleeing, he was killed by men who were once his allies. And this is how Alexander the Great became master of the world at the age of 24. Then, driven by irrepressible ambition, Alexander the Great headed with his armies towards India. This vision parallels the leopard with 4 wings recorded in Daniel chapter 7, verse 6. Let's continue reading verse 8. And the goat became exceedingly great, but being in his greatest strength, that great horn was broken, and in its place 4 other notable horns went out towards the 4 winds of heaven. The significant phrase in this verse is the following: when he was at his greatest strength, that great horn was broken. Now, what was it that broke that horn? There was no human power that could break it. We are told that when Alexander the Great came to power, the whole world was under his rule. Tradition says that Alexander the Great sat down and cried because there were no more worlds to conquer. He had already conquered the known world of his time, even reaching India and emerging victorious. However, in the midst of his enormous projects, Alexander the Great was attacked by a fever after having been drinking in several sessions throughout an entire night. And he died in Babylon in the year 323 BC and was 32 years old. The prophet Daniel comments that he was magnified exceedingly, which is why that great horn was broken. The sudden death of Alexander the Great caused great and prolonged conflicts to determine who would take charge of his vast empire. Finally, it was divided into 4 parts among his main generals. This is what Daniel had announced. In his place, there went out 4 other notable horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. This also corresponds to the 4 heads of the winged leopard in the parallel vision of Daniel chapter 7, verse 6. After this I looked, and behold another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. This beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now, after several conflicts, Alexander the Great's empire after his death would be divided between his generals in the following way. Ptolemy received Egypt and other parts of Asia Minor. Cassander received the territory of Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus received Thrace and other parts of Asia Minor, western Bithynia, Phrygia, Mysia, and Lydia. Seleucus received the rest of the Alexandrian Empire, which included Syria, Israel, and Mesopotamia. Now, the rest of the prophecy focuses on an event that was fulfilled once before the first coming of Jesus Christ, and that will be repeated on a much larger scale before his second coming, also described in our article on the abomination of desolation. Let's read verses 9 and 12. And from one of them came a little horn, which grew far to the south and to the east, and toward the glorious land. And he became great even to the host of heaven. And he cast down part of the army and the stars to the ground and trampled them underfoot. He even magnified himself against the Prince of Hosts, and through him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown to the ground. And because of the transgression the army was given to him, along with the continuous sacrifice, and he cast down the truth, and did whatever he wanted, and prospered. Jesus' only reference to the book of Daniel is to a future abomination of desolation, as we can see in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24 verse 15, and in Mark chapter 13 verse 14. But beginning in Daniel chapter 8 verse 9, we have a prophecy of an abomination of desolation that was historically fulfilled in 160 BC. Clearly, there must be more than one abomination of desolation, and the prophetic descriptions given in Daniel had a double meaning. In Daniel chapter 8 verse 9, the first abomination would come from a little horn that would arise from the division of the great horn that was broken. The big horn represented Greece and Alexander the Great. In contrast to the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 verse 8, which accompanied the 10 horns of the fourth beast that represented the Roman Empire, the little horn of Daniel chapter 8 verse 9 represents a leader who would come out of one of the divisions of Alexander's empire. Although these little horns of Daniel chapters 7 and 8 are different individuals or leaders, they have one thing in common: they persecute God's people. This little horn from Daniel chapter 8 verse 9 would do incredibly bad things to the Jewish people and the temple site in Jerusalem. This little horn would turn out to be Antiochus IV Epiphanes of the Seleucid Empire, also called the King of the North, in chapter 11 of Daniel. Antiochus had inherited the northern kingdom, and although he had an insignificant beginning, he set about extending his borders towards India in the east and Egypt in the south. In this last direction, he had to fight against Ptolemy, a descendant of another of Alexander the Great's generals. This caused a lot of problems for the Jewish people since they were in the middle. This is what he means when he says that he grew up toward the glorious land. This led to a tremendously arrogant attitude, which the prophet describes as follows: "And he magnified himself to the host of heaven." It is difficult to know exactly what the army of heaven refers to. It may have to do with an army of angels, although at this time it may simply be used as a metaphor to indicate the pride of this little horn that in its arrogance claimed to be a rival to the God of heaven. In any case, he tells us that some of the army and the stars he cast down and trampled on them. This implies that he achieved certain victories. Now, who is this part of the army, and who are the stars that he cast down? From the next verse, it seems that this is an attack against the people of Israel and their services in the temple of God. It also says that he magnified himself against the Prince of Hosts. In verse 25 of this same chapter, he also adds, "And he will rise against the Prince of Princes, but he will be broken, though not by human hands." The prince in both verses is Jesus Christ. Formerly, Antiochus Epiphanes fulfilled the first abomination. In the time of the end, one who will be a kind of little horn of verse 9 will follow in the footsteps of Antiochus, as alluded to in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 4. The latter will actually be the fulfillment of the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 verse 8. It created that everyone knows that I am referring to the Antichrist who will rule in the Great Tribulation. Now, let us return to Antiochus Epiphanes. He became the great persecutor of the people of Israel. His intentions towards them were not only to conquer them militarily, as other powers had done. He wanted to end their religion and erase their culture. Let us notice what it says. "And through him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown to the ground." He did not physically destroy the temple, but desecrated it, offering pigs on its altar, and erecting in the place of the sacrificial altar an altar to the pagan god Zeus. In this way, he defiled the sanctuary of God and caused the offerings to cease. And not only that, but he tried by all means to Hellenize the Jews, getting many to leave the law of God and surrender to Greek culture. And he cast down the truth and did whatever he wanted and prospered. In this way, he gained control over the Jewish people, which is why he says, "And because of the transgression, the army was given to him." Of course, not everyone surrendered to him, but a rebellion arose led by the Maccabees who resisted. But the truth is that he managed to seize power in Israel. The Expositor's Bible commentary explains the gravity of Antiochus's exploits. It should be noted that the title Epiphanes, the illustrious, also has the meaning of every evident or manifest. From his coins, we know that he linked his epiphanies with the added title of Theos, God. So they both meant illustrious God or manifested God. Therefore, my listening friend, in conclusion, Antiochus Epiphanes prefigures the Antichrist. Let's continue reading verses 13 and 14. Then I heard a saint speaking, and another of the saints asked him who spoke, "How long will last the vision of the continual sacrifice and the desolating prevarication giving up the sanctuary and the army to be trampled?" And he said, "Until 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be purified." Next, Daniel refers to the conversation of two saints, who were probably angels, who were talking about the vision he had just had. The purpose is to clarify the duration of the atrocities that the little horn would carry out on God's people. The time for the sanctuary to be cleansed would be 2,300 evenings and mornings, which is equivalent to a little more than 6 years. The fulfillment turned out just as prophesied. Antiochus Epiphanes began desecrating the temple by murdering the high priest Onias III on September 12, 171 BC, and ended with the restoration of temple worship under Judas Maccabeus on December 25, 165 BC. This gives a total of 6 years and 110 days, that is 2,300 days. However, this historical fulfillment with Antiochus was only partial, since the Lord Jesus Christ himself, many years after it had taken place, again referred to that same prophecy to point towards a new time of tribulation for the Jewish nation that would start with the same signal. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, it says, "Therefore, when you see in the holy place the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet." That future period is known as the Great Tribulation, and the Lord said of it that there has been nothing like it from the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. Let's continue reading verses 15 and 19. "And it came to pass, as I Daniel considered the vision and sought to understand it, behold, there stood before me one in the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who cried out and said, 'Gabriel, show this man the vision.' He then came near where I was, and at his coming I was amazed, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, Son of Man, for the vision is for the time of the end.' While he was talking to me, I fell asleep on the ground on my face, and he touched me and made me stand. And he said, 'Behold, I will teach you what is to come at the end of wrath, because that is for the time of the end.'" Gabriel assured Daniel that this vision had to do with the end of time, with what is to come at the end of wrath. This is a problem for some, because we see that the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8, from verse 1 to 14, was fulfilled in the days of the Medo-Persian and Greek empires, especially in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. The term time of the end, and what is to come at the end of wrath, commonly refers to what we think of as the end of times, which was not fulfilled more than 100 years before Jesus was born. The answer is that, although this prophecy was fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes, it is also a final fulfillment of the Antichrist, referring to the time of the end. Antiochus Epiphanes is sometimes called the Antichrist of the Old Testament. He figures the Antichrist of the end of times. Just as Antiochus Epiphanes rose to power with force and intrigue, so will Antichrist. As he persecuted the Jews, so will the Antichrist. Just as he stopped the sacrifice and desecrated the temple, so will the Antichrist. Just as it seemed to be a resounding success, so will the Antichrist. From what Antiochus did to the Jews in his day, therefore, one can know the general pattern of what Antichrist will do to them in the future. Let us also notice that Gabriel is speaking to him about what is to come at the end of wrath. We understand that it is about the wrath of God that came upon his people Israel as a consequence of his unfaithfulness, and that was brought through the Gentile nations. Therefore, we must consider that it refers to a period that began in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, when he put an end to the Davidic monarchy and took the Jews captive to Babylon, and which will last until the time when the Lord Jesus Christ, the legitimate descendant of King David, sits again on the throne of Israel. Of course, before this happens, it will be necessary for the Jewish people to repent of their sins and believe in their Messiah. It will be then that the Gentile nations will be judged by the Lord. Let's continue reading verses 20 and 22. As for the ram that you saw, which had 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that was between his eyes is the first king. And as for the horn that was broken, and 4 took its place, it means that 4 kingdoms will arise from that nation, although not with the strength of it. Note that this king of Greece is described as the first king. This undoubtedly points to Alexander the Great, because although his father Philip II of Macedonia had unified all the city-states of Greece except Sparta, it was his son Alexander who is considered the first Greek king. Since Alexander died very young when he was at the peak of his power, he was succeeded by 4 of his generals who formed 4 different kingdoms, although they never managed to match the power and extent of Alexander's kingdom. Let's continue reading verses 23 and 25. And at the end of their reign, when the transgressors have reached the end, there will arise a king who is haughty in countenance and understands riddles. And his power will be strengthened, but not by his own strength, and it will cause great ruin, and it will prosper, and it will do wantonly, and it will destroy the strong and the people of the saints. With his sagacity he will make deception prosper in his hand, and in his heart it will be magnified, and without warning it will destroy many, and he will rise against the Prince of Princes, but he will be broken, though not by human hands. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been referred to is true, and keep the vision, for it is for many days. Verses 23 and 26 are a repetition of verses 9 and 14, but with more emphasis on the final abomination of desolation. There is again a dualism in verses 23 and 25 that once applied to Antiochus, but now points to the final fulfillment of which Christ spoke in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. Speaking of this end-time persecutor, Daniel notes, "And he will rise against the Prince of Princes, but he will be broken, though not by human hands." This is very similar to the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's statue dream, where Christ, the stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands, destroys the last kingdom and the abomination it will have caused. Although part of the vision of Daniel chapter 8 has been fulfilled historically, Daniel was told that, "And you keep the vision, for it is for many days." He was told to do the same regarding the vision of the Great Tribulation and the time of the end, as we see in chapter 12. The same command to keep the vision, or shut up the words, given in both chapters, indicates that the sections of these chapters are for the same end-time period. Let's continue reading verse 27. "And I, Daniel, was broken, and I was sick for some days. And when I recovered, I attended to the king's business. But he was terrified because of the vision of him, and he did not understand it." This experience left Daniel broken, and he was sick for a few days. Something similar had happened to him at the end of the previous vision in chapter 7. What was the reason for this reaction? He explains that he was frightened because of the vision and did not understand it. Although he could not understand the full meaning of the vision, he nevertheless perceived that it announced a terrible rebellion against the God of heaven himself, and times of great suffering for his people Israel. It is not that Daniel did not trust in divine sovereignty and knew that he always has the last word, but that did not stop him from grieving for his people. This also warns us that receiving the revelation of the Word of God is not always going to be a pleasant sensation, especially those parts that have to do with the judgment that God announces on sin. And on the other hand, Daniel's attitude should lead us to an attitude of prudence regarding prophecy. If he, who had received it directly, says that he did not understand it, we must avoid believing that we know everything and can give an exact explanation of every detail. A little humility never hurts in this regard. At this point, Daniel needed to rest and meditate on everything that God had revealed to him to gain strength and continue on his path. And so we come to the end of this video. Thank you very much for being part of our channel. God bless you very much. From me, that is all for today, and with me it will be until the next video.